before we get to the story itself, though, we have to do a little brief review because there's a few important details which maybe we missed while we were reading through that are important for like prelude information in order for us to really enter this very intense scene with all the background knowledge that we need. So interestingly enough, the last class that I was here teaching and learning with you was the story of David and Goliath. And that's the story where David comes on the scene. He shows up. He's this young, scrappy up-and-comer, and he defeats the giant Goliath and begins to be noticed by King Saul, Hamelech Shaul, Shaul Hamelech. And over those two classes that we learned together, we really got to the bottom of what the difference was between David and Shaul, why Shaul lost the kingship, and why it was then given to David. And there are many facets to this story, but I'm just reminding us of what we spoke about. We talked a lot about how Shaul had the appearance of a king. He was kind of personally maybe more reserved and modest and humble. He was tall and good looking and very attuned to his perception amongst the people. And that led him to place more stock in what the people wanted from him than what God wanted from him. And this led to his downfall. And so when God chose David as a successor, he chose someone who was youthful and rugged and had this maybe uncultured appearance, but was genuine and bold and acted in a way that maybe Shaul never did, and that really showed how his heart was with God. And this idea of his heart being with God is a theme which comes up over and over again with David. And that background is going to be really important as we continue forward in the story and look at this background information. And today, what we're really going to be looking at is one of the many facets of David Hamelech. He's many things. He's a poet, a warrior. And one thing that David is known for is his relationship with women. He's called a lover. And this story is as many of his love stories is quite tragic. And what we're going to try to think about together is what went wrong in this story. Why didn't this relationship work out? And we have to begin with noticing a very important feature about David's love. Many people in the story in the narrative are said to love David using the word ahav. This person loved David, that person loved David. But it actually never says that David loved anyone else, right? All the times the word is received to him. Many people love him, but he never is ascribed that feeling by the text. And that's just, I think, something important to pack away when we think about David as a lover. Right? What does that mean? And how in this story did that love go so wrong? So let's begin with a little bit of review. But really at the beginning of the relationship of David and Michal is really the relationship between David and Shaul. So we first see this idea of love applying to David from Shaul. Shaul himself, when he meets David the first time, David shows up and Shaul looks at him and it says, Vaye'ehavehu me'od, that Shaul loved David a lot, so much, intensely. From this first meeting between Shaul Hamelech and David, there is this intense feeling of affection and love. And this is even before he kills the giant Goliath. And that Shaul himself starts out loving David. We find out a little bit later on, after David slays Goliath, that Other members of Shaul's family similarly fall in love with David. The text tells us, and this is a famous quotation, right? Yehonatan nikshara benefesh Yehonatan nikshara benefesh David, that the soul or spirit of Yehonatan, who is Shaul's son, is kashur, is tied up with, tangled with David's soul. Vayehavehu Yonatan kinafsho, and Yonatan loved David like himself, and that leads Yonatan to make a brit, with a covenant with David, which we see actually becomes a very important theme in the story later on. Why is he making this covenant? Be'ahavato oto kinafsho, because he loved him like himself. And so we're already seeing that the family, Shaul himself, Shaul's son, loves David. And then just a few psukim later, we find out V'chol Yisrael v'Yehuda ohevet David, ki hu yotzei uva lefnehem, that all of Bnei Yisrael loves David. David clearly has something attractive and charismatic about his character, his identity, that he shows up and people love him. Shaul, Yehonatan, all of Bnei Yisrael. However, by this point in the story, Shaul has begun, as you've talked about in preceding weeks, begun to become extremely suspicious. He has this ruach ra, this evil spirit that haunts him, and he begins to become extremely suspicious of David. Ultimately, we know for good reason. And Shaul begins to scheme. Now, the idea of Shaul scheming is actually extremely consistent with this image we have of him thus far. What does scheming mean? It means, right, what is like this bad, it means that you are looking one way, you're acting one way externally, but really there's something going on behind the surface. You're sneaking, you're planning in a way where you don't want other people to see what you're doing, but you are kind of behaving and lying in a sneaky way to make something happen for you. And this is consistent with Shaul, who's very concerned about his external appearance and pleasing the people, while his heart, right, we talked about his heart is perhaps in a different place. And so Shaul begins to scheme about David, and he tells David that he's going to give him his oldest daughter Meirav. Now, interestingly, David had already won Meirav's hand because David killed Goliath. And if we remember, Shaul had already promised that whoever kills Goliath will get his daughter's hand in marriage. So actually, he's already earned marriage with the king's daughter. But Shaul is scheming away, and he says, right, like, I'm going to try to figure out a way to get David out of the way, that doesn't make it look like I did it. So in order for him to marry my daughter, I'm going to tell him he has to go out to war to the Plishtim. Ultimately, by the time he reaches the negotiation for Michal, he basically sends David out to do what Shaul thinks is an impossible military task, hoping that David would get killed along the way so that he doesn't have to worry about David in the future, and he doesn't have to marry off either of his daughters or his second daughter to David. It's interesting to note as we move forward and we read how David acts in a similar kind of situation, that David ends up doing something somewhat similar later on with Bathsheba. David wants Bathsheba. He ends up sending her husband to war to intentionally die in war. He also begins to scheme at that point. So we're going to see in the long term that David himself kind of falls prey to this same kind of motivation as a king to be scheming. But right now, we have him kind of the quote unquote victim of this. And for some very fascinating and interesting reason, Meirav, the oldest daughter, she had been given in marriage to someone else. And instead, even though he can't marry Meirav, Michal enters the scene. And the first piece of information that we get about Michal is just like Shaul at the beginning, and just like Yehonatan, we find out, Vate'ehav Michal bat Shaul et David, that Michal, the daughter of Shaul, had fallen in love. She loved David. Now, this is a very striking verse because I believe this is the only time in Tanakh that love is attributed to a woman, that we say that a woman loved someone. And this is, I think this idea of placing this level of feeling into a female character is remarkable. And she has the same emotional love, this drawing to David, that so many other people before her had. And Shaul's kind of like feels lucky. Okay, so the thing with Meirav didn't work out. Let me marry Michal off to him instead. And what's interesting is because it becomes very clear as we follow through the story on chapter 2, on page 2, when Shaul tells the couriers here, oh, go tell them that everyone loves you. You should go marry in. It's very clear here that Shaul, the text tells us, Shaul intended to bring about David's death at the hands of the Plishtim. That in this story, Shaul intends to use Michal as a pawn, right? Michal is a pawn in his game. He's capitalizing on her love for David and saying, oh, perfect, you love it, sure, you can marry, but instead you have to go fight this war and maybe you're going to die, right? He's using Michal as a pawn in his games, his political games with David. I think it's interesting to note that when Shaul speaks about himself and his feelings towards David, even when he's telling his servants to tell David, to try to get David to want to do this whole scheme with Michal, he says, tell them, Hine chafetz b'cha hamelech v'chol avadav ahevucha. The king chafetz, the king wants you, but all of his servants, like, they love you. And so Shaul HaMelech is already backing away from the feeling of love that we originally saw that he had. He can't even lie about it when he talks to his couriers, right? He doesn't use the word ahav anymore. But we see that everybody else does love David. But David, our successful, passionate warrior, he goes out to war, he comes back successful, and Shaul is forced to give Michal to him in marriage. And this story ends with this summary of Vayar Shaul, that Shaul realizes or sees Vayeda ki Hashem im David. It has to be, the only possibility here is that God is on David's side. U Michal bat Shaul ahevato, right? That, and his own daughter actually loves him. That then he realizes, like, oh, no, now I'm in big problems. That his scheming, his setup, his situation is going to be for vain, not only because Hashem really is going to be on David's side. He sees that his own daughter, who he married off to David, really loves him. And that is a recipe for his own disaster and his own demise, because it's coming from both ends, from within his own family and from God, and he's very worried. And I think, this is my own conjecture, but I think the text is making a play on words here. So after this happens, Vayosef Shaul lir'o mipnei David. Shaul continues, or is even more afraid of David. Vayihi Shaul oyev et David kol hayamim. And that literally translates to that Shaul was an oyev, an enemy to David all of his life. I think that is a Hebrew play on what we would have expected, or what we start off with, which is ohev, right? That it would be very easy almost to play a trick on your ear, to say Vayihi Shaul ohev et David kol hayamim. He loved him. But no, it's this very slippery slope from David becoming his ohev, his beloved, to his oyev, his enemy. And that really solidifies this very awkward relationship between father, daughter, son-in-law, wife, husband, father-in-law. This is a very messy triangle. And still reviewing, right, this triangle gets even more complicated once Shaul literally just starts trying to kill David. And he ends up one night sending basically murderers to stand outside his door to kill him. And But what happens? Who saves David? Michal. And it's very important here to notice her title. The text does not throw these titles about lightly. What is Michal called here? Vataged leDavid Michal ishto. Michal, his wife. Michal, David's wife, tells him, okay, you have to get out of here. She spoils the secret. She knows what's going on, and she kind of shows her hand and saves David's life, ultimately betraying her father. And in that moment, her title, her description changes. Before now, she was repeatedly described as Michal Bat Shaul, the daughter of Shaul, because what role did she have in the story? She was here as a way for this young, scrappy guy to like marry in to the king's household. And so what role did Michal play? She was the daughter of the king. But no longer, the text is telling us, as we see from her actions in this story, is Michal the daughter of the king. Michal is now the wife of David, and she acts in loyalty to him, and she helps him escape. The way she does it is important for later on in the story. What does she do? She takes him and she lets him out the bottom of, she lets him out the window. Vatered Michal et David be'ad hachalon, right? She ties the sheets into knots and she lets him down the side of the window. I'll actually show you. This is a great illustration of this. Before, for those of us who do not know, Rabbi Steinsaltz, let me look at our eyes. This is like very, very important. Rabbi Steinsaltz passed away on Friday, and he was amazing for many, many reasons. And one book that he wrote that I just am obsessed with is this book. It's called Biblical Images by Rabbi Steinsaltz. And he writes short essays about different characters in the Tanakh. And they're absolutely beautiful. He weaves together pshat and drash and all different kinds of things. And I wanted to notice and mention his name, that I utilized this essay as I was preparing for this class, because I wanted this learning that we're doing to be a Eloi for his neshama. So I just wanted to show you that there's this excellent picture. Can you see it? I should have scanned it. Hold on. This is this like great picture of Michal leaning out the window, letting David down on the rope. And you could see her expression on her face. She's really worried. She's looking over her shoulder. She's afraid. She knows she's going to get in trouble for what it is that she's doing, which she does in the story, right? Shaul basically comes over to her and is like, excuse me, like, what did you just do? But she does it anyway, because we see this real loyalty that she has for her husband, which I think is safe to assume comes out of this genuine love that she feels for him. And so she lets him out the window, and she covers for him by, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, how he makes this whole contraption in his bed and he like covers it with a blanket and he puts like the hair and he makes it snore, right? That's what she does. She finds the trafim and she covers it with a blanket, and she makes it look like he's sick in bed, and they cover for him, and it's enough time for him to escape. And it's very interesting to note that in this story, she comes across very similar to one other woman, another female character in Tanakh, who also used trafim or had trafim and acted to protect her loved husband. And that is Rachel. Rachel hid the trafim from her father Lavan in order to protect their household. And it's interesting because Michal is actually a descendant of Rachel. Right? Rachel gave birth to Binyamin. Michal is from the tribe of Binyamin. Her father Shaul is from the tribe of Binyamin. And these two stories really bring these women together as acting in defense of the people they love, the men that they love. And it's interesting because we notice her behavior in this story is pretty schemy also. She does the same thing. She tells a lie. She makes a plan. She gets him out of there. She tells her dad, like, what was I supposed to do? He was going to kill me, right? She's very concerned and very aware of the way that she behaves is going to impact the way others, her father's court, perceives her. And she, within that awareness of her perception, acts and hatches a plan to protect and save the man that she loves. And it's very ironic that, I mean, listen, where did she learn how to scheme? Where did Rachel learn how to scheme? She grew up in the house of Lavan, right? Where did Michal learn to act this way? She's acting similarly in mode to Shaul, but she's using Shaul's mode of being against him to protect to protect David, who he's trying to capture, and that kind of tendency is also going to be important to note for the section of text that we're looking at together today. The continuation of the story, that part, if we stopped there, I think it would be a beautiful love story of sacrifice. But the story is, as it continues, is a little bit upsetting. After David escapes, Shaul marries Michal. First, David takes other wives. David marries Abigail, and he also takes Achinoam as a wife, and they're both his wives. And then immediately after we find out that David takes other wives, that's where the text tells us that it wasn't like David took his wives and then Shaul gave Michal to someone else, because the text here is V'Shaul Natan. It means he had already given a while ago. He had given Michal Bito, Eshet David. He gives Michal, his daughter, the wife of David, to another man, to Palti ben Laish, to this dude, this random guy, Palti ben Laish. That's who he gives her to. And so what this text is really doing is juxtaposing these two wedded individuals, right, David and Michal. And it's telling us that after they separated that night, after she saves his life and lets him out the window, he goes on his journey. I doubt he ever expects to see Michal again, right? He's like running away, and he marries these other women. And at the same time, she also is married elsewhere, and we really get this image of the actual shattering of their marriage, right? The breaking apart of their marriage, and they're both given to other people. And I think it's also here important to note, as we will when we reach the climax of the story, who is Michal here? Who does she belong to? And it's at this moment where we get the absolute most ambiguity about who she is, because my guess is she herself was feeling a tremendous amount of ambiguity about who she is. Shaul gives Michal Bito. She's his daughter again. She also at the same time is Eshet David. Right? In this moment, she's really torn. She knows she's another man's wife, and we know that she really loved him. She saved his life. And yet, Shaul is her father, and he is acting upon her and forcing her to marry another person. And this really is a real moment, I think, of tension within Michal that is ultimately not really up to her, but she gets given to another man. Just to end this part of the story, many moons later, once David begins to regain political power again, after Shaul is dead, David goes back to get Michal. He wants his wife back, and it's interesting because he sends messengers to get her back, and he says, "Tana et ishti et Michal." Give me my wife, Michal. Right? I got her fair and square. This was her bride price. Like, I paid it, etc. And so they do send someone to go take her. Vayikacheha me'im ish, from a man, well, it's interesting. It doesn't say isha, which is her husband, from another man, me'im Palti ben Laish, from this Palti ben Laish. And you'll notice that the way these names are described is parallel. David says, get me Ishti, my wife, and then says her name. And then when they take her away from Palti ben Laish, they say they take him from Ish, from a man, from her husband, from Palti ben Laish. And the reaction that Palti ben Laish has is he walks Vayelech ita Isha, her husband, walks with her and walks after her as she's being taken away from him, and he is bereft. He is crying. He is so upset. He's mourning so much that his wife has been taken from him by this, David, right? By David. And until the point where David's kind of military people are like, okay, you need to go away because you have to stop crying here because you're making a scene and it doesn't look right. And so then he goes and he leaves. And the scene is really, this relationship is very confusing. It's very unclear. What was the relationship between Michal and Palti ben Laish, right? We have a few complicating factors here. First of all, we have some, I don't even need to say halachic because that's even like anachronistic. We have some like just general marital norms that are way out of whack. For some reason, we don't have so much of a problem with like men marrying multiple women, but women cannot, once a woman is married to a man, she cannot marry another man, like, and they didn't like get divorced or anything, right? Like we'll just like literally pretend that David doesn't exist and like marries her off to Palti ben Laish. So we have the problem there. Then we have the problem that David goes back to get her. If she's now married to another man, you're not allowed to like go back to your wife who then had sex with somebody else, and then you like that's not allowed. So how could David then get her back? But then those are technical questions. What is this relationship that she had with Palti, right? Palti ben Laish, that he's walking after her crying and bereft. It seems to me here that at least on Palti ben Laish's end, there was some genuine feeling here that David is now showing up and tearing apart, almost similarly to the way that Shaul came in and teared their marriage apart. And it's really, I think, heartbreaking to see in this text that Michal really is getting like picked up and placed places and thrown around, right? Moved around by all of these men surrounding her in her life. And I think is very painful and very tragic. And I think you can tell that David's feelings towards her have changed as well. That when you look at the way David speaks about her in that section, he says, what does he want back? He wants et ishti, et Michal. I want my wife back. I won her fair and square with all of this bride price. It's about my property and getting my wife back. And who do I want her back from? From that man she married. Secondary to these titles and roles that these people fill are their names. My wife, Michal, right? And from who? Me'im ish, from this man, Me'im Palti ben Laish. And you're already beginning to see a difference here in the way that David is speaking about her. So just for those of you who are concerned about like David following the halachot of marrying women and remarrying and separating, there's this fascinating midrash in Vayikra Rabbah in which God says that there were 3 people who ran from sin, and as a reward, Hashem added Hashem's name to their name. Who are they? Yosef, Yael, and Palti. It goes through Yosef and it goes through Yael. But I gave us a source about Palti. So how do we know this about Palti? Because one verse says that Shaul gave Michal his daughter to Palti, right? The text tells us the man whose name, who got Michal as a wife was Palti. But when he gives a different verse, the verse when he gives her back, he's called Paltiel. Right? What led to this name change? Why was he Palti here and Paltiel here? Because when he took her in, and the word here used is nasev, which has a connotation of protection. When Palti took Michal in, he protected her, and then he had to give her back, and then he was Paltiel. He earned God's name because Hashem says, I testify that Paltiel did not touch the wife of David. Which is interesting, and that's why he has Hashem's name, that Hashem is testifying that Palti never touched her, that they never had sex with each other, which would mean that she was always still the wife of David, and he guarded himself for all of the time that they lived together, that she was like pretending to be her husband. They never touched, they never consummated their marriage, and therefore everything is still kind of pure and okay on kind of like that halachic end, which is, I think, a fascinating midrash. We see why the rabbis are motivated to write that midrash. But from the pshat of the text, we're seeing that whatever feelings Paltiel has for Michal, from the way he reacts when she leaves, is he seems to be very sad and very heartbroken. by this. All of this to say, this is the backstory that's important for us as we are about to take a close look at the final, or the penultimate, really, scene between David and Michal, which we're going to spend some time looking at very carefully together over the next probably 25 minutes. Before, I know there was a lot of review. Before we move forward, I want to pause and take any questions or comments up until this point before we spend a lot of time taking a look at these 10 psukim together.
Ora, I think what Shaul did here, Shaul sent David out to get killed. So that was easy. David's not coming back, so he could give her to anybody he wanted. David didn't do what he was supposed to do. And then he came back and said, no, I'm still here. I want my wife back.
So you think that Shaul genuinely did not know if David was alive or dead when he remarried Michal?
No, I think he didn't think he was going to be, whether he knew or not. He sent him out assuming he was going to get killed. The other question I had from the very beginning, and yes, last week and this week, didn't we all know, that Yehuda was going to be Malchus? Didn't Yaakov say that? So Shaul's Malchus was never real. I don't know where Shmuel came up with Saul. God gave it to him. But, that was never going to be
what God
real.
was doing. Yeah. Good.
Yeah,
So this question of like, how are we supposed to think about Shaul's kingship in general? The fact that he got anointed, he's from the wrong tribe, right? Like, this is a question that has come up on a number of occasions through this section of Navi. It is, again, the question is better than the answer. I think there's lots of different possible ways to answer it. One could be that they didn't really know, right? That whatever prophecy was given, or nevuah was given on Yaakov's deathbed was cryptic enough that it wasn't necessarily even going to be the case, or they didn't know it was the case. We gave other ideas that Shaul was king long enough to do a tikkun for his tribe on the horrors that happened at the end of Sefer Shmuel, Sefer Shoftim. And there's other things, right? Like, it didn't have to, Shaul could have had the kingship, Binyamin could have had the kingship for a while, and somebody else could have messed it up, right? It doesn't determine for sure, right, that Shaul needed to be the one to make mistakes. And I think there are many other answers. I think the fact that there are so many answers indicates that the question is better than the answer. But yeah, it's a tough one. We're going to come back to that idea, Ira, at the end of this section when we see the conclusion of David and Michal's relationship. I think is a pasuk that fits in very importantly to this conversation. Yeah, Vivian.
It doesn't seem to bother everybody that a lot of people who come in contact with with David. I just lost you.
Oh, no, you're here. I hear you.
I'm there. Okay, so let me just keep going. A lot of people who seem to come in contact with David seem to end up dead, and they're not all guilty either. And he seems to knock off all in the previous chapters that were part of this reading. He knocks off everyone who helped him to escape or helped him to rise. They all end up dead. It's not a good track record for an upcoming king.
Or is it a great track record, right? Like, it depends on what we mean by that, right? We're definitely troubled by the ethics of this. There are clearly political advantages, right? David is very complicated. He certainly acts, and you even see here in the way that he takes Michal back from Palti, right? There is definitely a side to him that is cold and calculating politically and militaristically that I'm with you, Vivian. I do also find that troubling on occasion.
Right.
Need that in the king. That was what made him strong also, that he had a certain armor, so to speak. And we learned also, many years ago, that Shmuel wasn't thrilled about the idea of a king. So taking him from Binyamin was like, oh, he's not going to last anyway.
Oh, good. Yeah, that was another possibility to answer Ira's question. I love what you just said, Ellie, because it reminded me of something very important, right? The first time that Shaul has an opportunity as king to act with authority was when he was anointed in his second anointment, and there were the people who were bad-mouthing him and talking down to him, which would be, I think, the kinds of people that David would be like, get them out of here, right? Off with their head. And what's Shaul's response? The first time, he stays quiet. And even the second time, when he has the political support of everybody, once he's been anointed, everyone else is like, let's kill those people who talk down to you, these people who are opposing your kingship. And what does Shaul do? He says, no, I don't want to execute them. Today's a happy day. I'm going to forgive them. And it's interesting to note that is a very stark difference to the way that David approaches the kingship, for sure.
That became his Achilles heel. That's why he didn't kill the king of
of Amalek, right? He also has mercy on the king of Amalek. Interesting.
Also, we learned this, I know, in school many years ago, that he was too shy and he didn't think enough of himself. That actually he was not king material. In a way, I mean, he was very gentle and he was modest, but he was too modest. I mean, it's just conjecture, but I remember learning that.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think what's fascinating is I think when we think of a value, what value we would want, what would we want our king to be like? I think we tend to the more forgiving side. We're like on Shaul's team here, right? But there is something that, right, David is, maybe it's uncomfortable for us as modern readers or as people who have a certain view of the role of the king and ethics and forgiveness and the exercising the power of the king and killing people. We're troubled by David's attitude surrounding these issues, which I think is very real. Unless somebody has a burning important question directly relevant to Michal, I would love to make sure we could look at this scene together. Okay, great. So on page 4 of your source sheet, we have this climactic interaction. David has finally solidified his kingship. And in order to really show that David has kind of serious control over the monarchy, he brings the Ark of the Covenant, he brings the Aaron into Jerusalem. And this is done with a huge party. I encourage everyone to read this text carefully because as we talk about it, there are going to be details that you might want to bring up. But he basically brings the Ark of God into Jerusalem, and he makes this huge party, and he's dancing with all of his might, which we see again a wholehearted, bold person that we know David to be. Interestingly, he's described as dancing in a linen robe. This is the word, right, ephod bod. This is a robe that's actually often associated with the kahuna, the priesthood. We know that Shmuel's mother would make him a little ephod bod every year and bring it to him when she went out to be Aliyah Regal. And it could be that David is trying to also take on the image and the clothing of a Kohen in addition to being a king, which is an interesting point. But either way, that linen robe apparently was not secured, fastened so securely, because we find out that later on that he may have accidentally exposed himself as he was dancing with all of this might and intensity, wearing a less secure garment. But this seems to be of no concern to him because he is blowing these trumpets and dancing with his whole heart as they bring in the Ark of the Covenant. And we find out this is interesting. We're setting up this scene that David is coming from afar. He's walking into the Ir David with this whole party and fanfare, and everything's very exciting out there on the street. And they're walking in to the city of Jerusalem. And we then see that as Vayihi at this moment, verse 16, and it was at the moment that Aharon Hashem, the Ark of God, came to Ir David, the city of David, that Michal bat Shaul nishkefa ba'ad hachalon. That Michal, the daughter of Shaul, is looking out the window. That's the scene. And Vatira et hamelech David mefazez umekarker lifnei Hashem. She sees him dancing with all of his might before God. Vativez lo biliba, and she despises him, has this very strong negative emotion towards him in her heart. And as readers who are attuned to the literary devices and motifs that have been woven together throughout this story since we first met Shaul HaMelech, I think there's a lot here in this verse. First of all, it's important to notice the possessives. The city belongs to David, The Aron belongs to Hashem, right? It's God's ark, and it's David's city. He is in control. He is in power. And we see Michal again, Michal bat Shaul. How is she described in this moment? Who does she belong to? She's Shaul's daughter. And she's not described as David's wife. She's Shaul's daughter. And we're going to see why that becomes so important in a moment. And what is she doing? She's nishkefa ba'ar hachalon. She's looking out the window. Now, the window in the story of Michal is important. We saw, what was the last time we saw Michal by a window? She was there. David was with her, and she was letting him out the window. Now, David is down below, distant from her. He's walking towards the city, and she is up there looking out the window. And the way she is, the place she is in that window hasn't changed, but her relationship with the man on the other side of the window is now drastically different. Because before, she let him down and out the window because she loved him and she was protecting him and she was his wife, and she chose him over her own father. And yet now we see Vativez lo biliba, in her heart. In her heart, she despises him. And this reminds us of these conversations about who sees the heart. God sees the heart, and we want somebody who has a heart that's following God and after God. But the fact that she has these dark, deep emotions in her heart reminds us not of David, but of Shaul, of her father. And this is kind of like a quick pan up to the window, but now we can pan the camera and we move back to the celebration, and we see that they take the Ark of God, they continue celebrating, they bring sacrifices, and David is hanging out with the people. Right here, he is described as the people's king. He is like handing out loaves of bread. Everybody loves him. But he's doing this from the context of his worship of God, that he prioritizes the placement of God, of the covenant, of the Ark of the Covenant in this special tent, in this special location. And only after he finishes bringing God's offerings, which is again reminiscent of Shaul, utilizing the offerings, right, where it leads Shmuel to say, God doesn't want your offerings, he wants you to listen. Here we have David bringing so many offerings because he's doing like this, he's honoring God, and he feels like he's serving God and prioritizing God, and then he distributes to all of Bnei Israel these special delicacies that are probably very exciting to the common people. He's handing out bread and cakes, and all of the nation is probably so overjoyed. And the text tells us, "Vayelech kol ha'am ish lebeito." Everybody goes home. Who's the last to go home? The guy handing out the party favors, right? And so the text tells us the last person to go home is Vayashav David levarich et beito. David is walking home. And now I'm sure David was like flying. He just had the best day of his life. He's so excited. He's coming home with this enthusiasm that he just danced in front of Aron Hashem. He just gave out, all the people love him, and he is returning to his own house. Just like everybody else went home, he's going home. And we immediately are sensing the difference between the domains that David fills. He is both a public individual and a private individual. And the tension between how do I appear on the outside to the public versus who am I on the inside? What's my home, right? What's my home life? And right, that dynamic is immediately brought home to us, which I think again heightens the image of a window that is so important in the story of Michal and David, right? What's a window? A window is this permeable boundary between like looking through what's outside and what's inside, what is public and what is private. And Michal herself, we're seeing, is really at the window because she is torn. Is she with David or is she with her father? Is she like her father? So we have David returning home, ready to bless his household. Michal bat Shaul, right? Notice again, who is she? She's bat Shaul. She's not his wife. We're going to see why in one moment. She goes likrat David to meet him. Now, if I was David and my wife was walking out my door to like meet me right now, that's like you're expecting something like, wow, amazing, you did such a good job today, right? Instead, though, we see that she says, Vatomer, she says, Ma nichbad right? How honorable Hayom is today is Melech Yisrael. Ma nichbad Hayom Melech Yisrael. How amazing is it to be the king today? She's about to like totally slam him, right? She's like, oh, it's not amazing that you are lowly and you revealed yourself to the eyes of everybody and you acted like a total loser. But she draws him in. She's so sharp, right? She's like, oh my God, aren't you great? You're totally embarrassing, actually, right? That's exactly what she does. She starts with this sarcastic question. And what is it that she criticizes him about? She says, Manichbar Hayom Melech Yisrael. Right? How honored today is the king of Israel. Who are you? You're the king. You were just out there in the street acting as the king of Israel, but you weren't, because you revealed yourself. You were close to, you showed your inside, right? What should be covered, you showed to just about anybody. And she talks specifically about rank and class and dignity, and cares about what the king looks like, Melech Yisrael looks like, from the perspective of the everyday people. And she feels like that level of lowering himself and not acting like what she thinks Melech Yisrael should act like, which is probably like what her father acted like: tall, reserved, dignified, being very conscious of the way people were perceiving him. That is the opposite of how David acted in this moment. He was totally taken up with his service of God and became completely unaware of acting in a way which Michal felt was dignified. And this point that she makes, I think, is supposed to really bring out in us a recognition that when the text keeps calling her Michal bat Shaul, that in this text, she actually is acting as a stand-in for Shaul. That this moment is actually a final face-off between David and not Michal, but David and Shaul. And that she embodies his ethos as somebody who cares about the physical external appearance and dignity of the king of Israel. And this becomes incredibly apparent in David's answer. David responds to her and he says, Vayomer David el Michal. Michal says to her, Lifnei Hashem, before God, Asher Bachar bi me'avich, umikol beito. Litzavot oti nagid al am Hashem, al Yisrael, v'sichakti lifnei Hashem. Who was I dancing in front of? I was dancing in front of the God who picked me over your father to rule over the people of Israel. And this is like daggers, right? What he's basically saying is, who are you to tell me how I'm supposed to act as a king? I got this job of kingship over your father who lost this job of kingship specifically because, says David, I am dancing in front of God with all of my heart. And now really it becomes hurtful when David finally responds to her and says, if you think I was dishonored dancing before God, I would dishonor myself in that way even more so, right? That's how much I love God. I no longer care about my personal dignity. That's not what it's about. It's about me serving God with my whole heart. And he says, I would be, right? I don't care if I'm low in my eyes, but if I was with those girls you're talking about, those slave girls that you think are too low to be with me, well, if I was with them, maybe they would show me a little bit of respect. Woo! This is like a fight. This is like a major marital fight, right? If I heard that people were saying these kinds of things to each other in their household, this is like major calls for like serious couples counseling. Not even joking. This is like mean and nasty on both ends. It's very harsh, but ultimately I think really reveals the underlying difference between David and Shaul, and therefore David and Michal. Even in the way David responds, there's no subtlety in his response at all. Michal has subtlety. She pulls him in. She says, Manichbad hayom melech Yisrael. There's no subtlety in David's response. David is bold, he is sharp, he is fierce, and he really rips into her, right? And that is totally who he is. And the specific thing he identifies also is he really sees, again, to the heart of the matter. That when Michal is complaining to him and saying, you're not acting like Melech Yisrael, his response is really seeing directly to the heart of what it is that she's saying is, he says, I am Melech Yisrael because I worship God, not like your father who is no longer Melech Yisrael. Your image of what it means to be Melech Yisrael is not accurate, says David. He does it in a pretty mean way. But ultimately, right, this fight between them, these three verses captures not just their fight, but it's actually summarizing the ideological difference between Shaul's vision of what it meant to be king and David's vision about what it means to be king. The last line of this story is very jarring. The last line simply says, "Umichal bat Shaul, Michal the daughter of Shaul, lo haya la yeled ad yom motah." She didn't have a child until the day that she died. And that's the end of the story. And this ending, I think, raises serious questions about what does that verse have to do with the rest of this story? Why are we getting this information right now? There's other places in the story of David where it talks about his lineage. It totally could have just told us that then somewhere else. There's clearly some kind of connection between this verse being here and the rest of this narrative. So there are some shot kind of basic interpretations of like, listen, they just had an insanely huge marital dispute. Like their love is no longer present. David has other wives he could be with. They simply just never were together sexually, and then they never had kids, right? That this is really kind of highlighting and underlining the breakdown of their personal relationship. Some Parshanim understand this to be a divine punishment to her for the way she spoke to David. I want to raise that because it is out there. I find that interpretation particularly personally difficult. And thank you, Shoshana asked, maybe she could have died in childbirth. It's an interesting possibility. It comes up later on the last page, which we're not going to have a chance to talk to. Later on, it seems to say, somewhere in the text seems to say that Michal actually had 5 sons through David, which is very weird. If you want more about that, take a look at the last page on the source sheet. We're not going to go into it together today. There are other possibilities, but I'll just share with you my interpretation of why this verse is here, and then we can wrap up, and I'm happy to hear any thoughts that you have if anybody would like to stay over time. I see this verse here as relevant, specifically by the way she's been identified throughout this story. That what's so fascinating about the marriage of Michal and David is that really it's the joining together of two lines of kingship. And had Michal and David had a child, that child would have been the obvious choice. She was his first wife. That child would have been the obvious choice for the successor for kingship. A conversation which ultimately really was very difficult, as we will find out as we continue reading Shmuel, Shmuel bet Melachim Aleph, like who's supposed to be the next king, was a very difficult decision. Had Michal and David had a child together, it would have been very clear who the next king would be, because she was Bat Shaul, she was the daughter of Shaul. But I think what this story is trying to tell us is that in Michal really was very much alive the line of Shaul's kingship, not just by blood, but through ideology as well. That the way she acted and comported herself showed that this line of Shaul was very, very much in her. That not only did she internalize his technique, as we saw that she did when she sneakily lets David out the window, she also internalizes his heart. That she despises David in her heart, that it wasn't just the action, that the way she actually permeated her insides. And that leads to a tension between her and David, not just personally, which clearly is there, but really leads to the tension and highlights the tension between the vision that the Tanakh and that Hashem has for kingship. And that had Michal had a child, that child would carry along Shaul's kingship. And that was something that God did not want, that David did not want. that in this moment, Michal is denied children, maybe divinely, maybe by David himself, specifically because the merging of those two lines of kingship is not what needs to happen for the future of Bnei Israel. It really needs to be that we end up with David's character, although I will grant it, Vivian raised it, many people raised it. David's character leaves what to be desired, and we will continue and learn about that and question that. But in this moment, what this last pasuk gives us is a real end to Shaul's line. It's not just about Michal, it's really about where this story has been going for the last book and a half of the Tanakh. And this is a really painful and sad story. In the article that Rav Steinsaltz wrote, he writes about how many stories in Tanakh and in the story of David have a very painful life and painful experience. Michal is certainly one of them. And that, I think, is thinking about her as a representative of Shaul is the key to understanding why David and Michal never could have really worked out, and their relationship ultimately ended so tragically. It's a really sad ending. I'm sorry. The next time I'm back, I'll be doing Amnon and Tamar, which is that'll be even more depressing. But I would love to stay and answer any questions if anybody has. If not, have a great week. Could she have died like in childbirth? That would I answer that question. How do we respond to that? I don't know that midrash. There's a midrash that Eglah had a child with David, and that Eglah is Michal. I don't know. Whoever asked me that. Oh, Mark. If you look at the last page of the source sheet, there's discussion about a fascinating verse at the end of Shmuel Bet, which talks about how David gave over people who are still from the line of Shaul, gave them over to be killed for a long background story reason. The text says that the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Shaul, who she bore to Adriel, the son of Barzillai, Hamecholati, right? That he gives over Michal's 5 sons. So that's more than one. I don't know exactly what that midrash is, but it in itself is very troubling, because if those are Michal's sons through David, then he gives his own sons away to be killed. And if they're not, that means she had kids with someone else. But this man listed here is not even Palti ben Laish, who like we at least know she's married to. If you look really closely, her husband listed here, Michal has these children with this man, Adriel. We've actually seen this man before. He's actually who marries her sister, Meirav. So it's very complicated. Yeah, it's very complicated. The Midrash does a great job on this one. It says she adopted her sister Meirav's children. They were called after her name. It might be a scribal error. Not really sure. That's about that other weird pasuk. Maybe that has something to do with the Midrash that Eglah was Michal, although I'm not holding that Midrash at the moment.
Aura?
Yeah. One second, Lily. One second, Lily, do you want to go? Lily was waiting. Sorry, I don't know who just spoke, but what's up, Lily? You have to unmute yourself. Oh, I can unmute you. Lily, 1 second.
Am I unmute?
There you go. You're unmuted. Go for it, Lily.
They both have very, very strong, they're very strong inside, and they could clash easily. So I can see that neither wanted the other sexually or any other way. They were really head on to each other. So, but I've been reading Shmuel, and he's not a nice person at all. I really don't, not David. It's very, very upsetting. All I'm seeing, by the way, with this whole reading that I'm doing, which I am just getting into now, there's just so much killing. Heads off, heads off, heads off. That's all I'm reading. And there's no joy and happiness. I don't see any good things. It's not very comforting.
I hear you. I totally hear you. I would say two things. I think the question is very strong about why we idealize, when we read the stories about him, why do we idealize David so much? Is a really very strong question.
A little like Game of Thrones.
Right. So the first thing that I have to say is I do think that like what it meant to be a king, like life, they used to be like life was short, brutish, and ugly. Like that was the world. Like being a king in general, kings did that. Kings cut people's heads off. Like that was like your job as the king, was like you killed people, right? So like there's a sociological answer and a historical answer, which is that our sense about what it means to be a strong leader is very different than what it would have meant to be a strong leader then. Now, the problem with giving historical answers to these kinds of questions is, well, if it's ethical to not just kill people, then it shouldn't matter if it was historically the case or not. The king of Israel, who we idealize, shouldn't just be killing people. Absolutely. Like I totally hear you. And I think it's an interesting challenge. What I'll say about David is he's a really two-sided, he's really like, he seems like he's two people in one. And it's Shaul is the one that we saddle with this like ruach ra, he's so paranoid, right? Like David really seems to have two very different personalities. If you want an overview of this or a beautiful insight onto the complex character of David in a way that is honest and redeeming, I would really recommend the book that's quoted on the last page of this source sheet. It's called David, the Divided Heart, by David Wolpe. It is an easy read. It is light, but it is very well written, great content. He covers the whole life of David. It's fantastic. It's by David Wolpe, W-O-L-P-E. He is a rabbi in LA, I believe, in California. It's a great book, really lovely read, especially if you've read the text recently. It's a really good read. Strongly recommended.
But can I say something?
I think someone else had a question,
Yeah,
and then Ellie.
I did.
Yeah, go for it.
So, by the way, I find just in that discussion, I find a lot to be meritorious in David's character in this section, because he continuously had respect for the king of Israel,
Exactly.
Joel, and he had many opportunities to kill him, and he didn't. And he continued saying he was God's anointed, and he came. So I think that's a very strong, high quality. But I had one section here that, and I understand that Shaul had mood swings and he had some personality issues and perhaps depression and so forth. Couldn't study out the justification of him having 40 some odd Kohanim murdered and the Kohen Gadol murdered. I mean, and in my world, you can, I mean, there's a lot of things you can do, but killing Kohanim and killing the Kohen Gadol strikes at the heart of our relationship with the Almighty. And it didn't seem like there was any justification for that unless I missed it. Could you give us a little clarity on that, perhaps?
For Shaul killing out the city, Nov?
Yeah.
I don't think there is. I mean, I don't think there is a justification for it. I think the text itself is very clear that it was a horrific thing. Like, I think I don't know. I don't feel like I have to. I think it's okay to say that. I mean, unless you want me to try to justify it. I don't.
No. And usually you kill people who are after you, who are who are trying to, where
they were accomplice. David showed up in their city. David was like, give me something. I need something. Right. They helped. I mean, they helped out a fugitive of the king. Right. I think that would be like the closest you could get to at least from Shaul's perspective, why he did it. Right. His number one enemy showed up in their town and they helped him out and they were accomplice and they protected him and then they let him go. Right. Like that could be. I mean, that is why Shaul killed out the whole city. That doesn't justify it ethically, but that is the technical answer, I believe, why he did it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, pretty decided.
Mazel tov.
Oh, thank you.
Mazel tov, yes.
Thank you.
Wasn't that one of the things that Shmuel warned them? A king's power is absolute. You may not like it. You want a king, it comes with a lot of good and a lot of bad. And people lived in a different kind of, and the one thing that occurred to me a few weeks ago when I was reading the Parsha, Hashem tells people to kill all of Midian, to kill all of, I mean, it was so much a part of the fabric of life. You kill out a whole tribe, you kill out a whole nation. So killing, life was short and difficult.
Ellie, I totally hear you. I think you're onto something when you share that historic perspective. I think that was more common back then to like say you have to wipe out this whole group of people.
I mean, I read the Parsha with Midian, and I didn't realize how bad it was. I mean,
Midian, Amalek, right? Like Amalek is our number one example of that. But I think I want to just I think you're right. And I also want to raise what I had said before is that when we make historical justifications for things that we believe are in modern times unethical or very complicated ethically, when we make justifications for that, I think it's very fair to say, I think it's very fair for us to say, like, if it's unethical, which we are bothered by it, you're not supposed to just kill out people wholesale. We're bothered by the use of violence, even if you don't want to go so far as to say it's unethical. It's not ideal, and we would want to hold these people to an ideal standard. And if the Torah is an ethical document that's supposed to be teaching us not just historically what happened, but messages about how to live, it becomes challenging to see people acting in a way which might be historically justifiable, but doesn't make it ethical and ideal.
I'm not excusing it or justifying it. I'm trying to understand the context in which people are killed wholesale. A whole city's wiped out, and nobody seems to make a big deal of it. I mean, yes, they say it was awful, but they went on to do. I mean, one of the kings went on to destroy an entire line of the king, and another one. I mean, this stuff went on all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think both.
That's why we have leaders and not saints.
Good, right? And so then that Vivian raises a really good point.
That's why we have what?
Leaders and not saints. Meaning, we also acknowledge the fact that our leaders might act in a way which isn't perfect, right? And they might do that for historical reasons. They might do that for personal flaw reasons, but we don't necessarily have to. And this is what I was just saying before with the question about the city of Kohanim is I don't think we have to say that every single thing that these people, these protagonists, what does that even mean, right? In the Tanakh did was totally ethical and totally right? We're not looking for that in the people, in our ancestors, which is really a relief because it would be really hard to find it. People do it, but that perfect ethical track record is not what we're expecting. I think the way the story continues, honestly, from how David where David ends up, I think the text is really clear that he made some really damaging decisions, right? I don't think that the text is telling us when you read it that like David was perfect and therefore had a perfect life and everything he did was great. So many of his decisions end up coming to hurt him afterwards. And maybe that's the point, right? Yeah, maybe that would be an okay thing for a king to do. Kings have absolute power and use them. But that's the whole story of David and Bathsheba. He has absolute power. He uses that absolute power. It's technically justifiable, I guess, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea and the right thing to do and that Hashem's going to like celebrate that, right? It's so complicated. Yeah, Miriam.
The difference there is the Navi tells us specifically, David did the wrong thing there. And here we have to guess what does the Navi want to tell us about David's character? Where, are we supposed to be admiring him for his military skills, or are we supposed to be judging him for saying he's, and because he becomes such a figure of religious admiration with the Tehillim, it becomes very important to know who are we admiring.
Amazing, amazing. Miriam, that is such a good point because I think it speaks to why studying Nevi'im, when we say like the stories in Nevi'im, actually is very complicated because we don't have this very clear voice coming out from heaven saying, you did the right thing. Yay, you, this is your reward. You did the wrong thing. Therefore, this is your punishment, right? We don't have that same clarity from anybody, right? The narrator of the text is not clearly telling us always like, oh, this was a good thing, this was a bad thing. And that leaves us guessing in a way that can be sometimes a little bit uncomfortable. Somebody pointed out to me before class started that there's a big change as we move in these stories. Like the voice of God in general is less present. In general, the prophets coming and saying specifically, yes, do this, don't do this, is less present. And that really leaves us in exactly the situation that Miriam raised, which is that we sometimes struggle to figure out exactly how we're supposed to feel about what actions these characters in the Tanakh are taking.
Sometimes I think, and I'm gonna let you go. I don't want to say, we don't have
My
heroes.
favorite thing to do. Yeah.
We don't have heroes who are perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the Torah, you know,
Right.
it's unvarnished, unwhitewashed, and we see people with their flaws. In most cases, it should be a lesson. I don't know if it always works because of what you just said,
Right.
but we don't have these, you know, these perfect heroes and the saints who never did any wrong.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I think characterizes Judaism.
Yeah. Beautifully said. Ira, you wanted to say something?
Two quick things. One thing is, I think the last statement that you studied tonight is a clear statement on God's part as to which side he was on. I mean, I think it's very clear. He was on David's side, not on Bathsheba's side. You know, okay, Michal's side. The other thing I want to say is, we can't judge what went on then by today's standards. This is not a chess match. You don't get up at the end, shake hands when you win or lose, and walk away. The winner there kills everybody. The loser dies. I mean, it's true historically in every sense of the word. So we can't sit here and say David shouldn't have done this or he should have done this. God did it all through the Chumash, and now this is the way it went. The standards obviously changed, and today we don't do that. But that's what was going on. And you know, I don't think we can sit here and judge him. I mean, David to me is a poet, a great leader, a great king. He made a mistake. He made a bad mistake, but even that he wasn't punished. He was rewarded. That son became the king. So
Not that
I mean,
son. That son died. The next son became.
No, I'm talking about Shlomo.
Right.
I'm talking about
Shlomo was
Shlomo.
not. I just want to be. Yes, Shlomo was not actually the product of the initial union between David and Bathsheba. That child dies. And the reason why I'm pointing it out is when we get to reading it, that actually breaks David's heart. It's very upsetting to him. You're right. Ultimately, but David and Bathsheba end up having Shlomo. But I just think that's a very important point. And I do think, by the way, Ira, thank you, because I think most people think that that's true. But I hear what you're saying. I think you come out on one very clear side of this question of historical accuracy. I just want to say about your last point about Hashem coming out clearly on David's side. I would agree with you if this was a divine case of God closing her womb. It's not 100% clear that that's the case from the text. It's very possible that David just never had sex with her again. Right? Like I would raise, and in which case, and we're not even leaving Hashem up to possibility. We're like just being like David didn't let it happen, right?
But the placement of that pasuk and the clarity of it is what gives you the message. Why it happened, how it happened,
right,
is not what I'm saying.
Absolutely.
That pasuk didn't need to be there, except for the fact there was just this argument, and it came out, and clearly that tells you which side, you know, the rest of the story goes.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Thank you.
My pleasure, everyone. It's so good to see everyone. Take care.
I don't have a camera on this computer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very exciting news. Mazel tov.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll get back to you on the Gemara thing.
Please do, Ellie. Really no pressure. Really no pressure.
Oh,
I
I
just
know.
want you to know.
Because my Hebrew is fluent, so
Then I think you might be fine.
okay.
Okay, no pressure, but
No, I know.
I'd love to see you there.
I like to pressure myself.
Excellent. Okay, bye everyone. Have a great night.
Bye.
You too. Thank you.